Hello everyone, Trophy Wine Hunter. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm doing a review of the Chateau Margaux 2003. And this is in celebration of 1 million views on YouTube. And I know that a lot of people may say for a lot of YouTube channels that's not significant, but for me it's huge. I've never thought I'd get to this stage, and I really want to thank my viewers and subscribers for putting up with me and staying with me on this journey for the last 3 to 4 years. This wine is really special. I've done a previous video on Chateau Margaux where I went through the history of that. It was the 1995 vintage, and I'll have that at the end of this video. So if you want to learn more about the history of Chateau Margaux, then you can go to that video. This video, I'm going to focus on this vintage 2003 and maybe just give a little summary comparative in my opinion between this and some of the other early 2000 vintages. Chateau Margaux, as a generality, typically does not do as well in what we would call really hot vintages. And that you'll see that a lot of times with what we call the classic or really spectacular vintage. Sometimes wines in the Margaux region will not do as well. There's a couple of reasons for that. There's more Merlot in Margaux region wines than, let's say, compared to Pauillac wines or St. Julien wines. And because of that, many times because of the location of Margaux, it is one of the earliest places that is picked. So it doesn't do as well in very hot vintages if the grapes are picked late in the season. By comparison, it does quite well in off vintages. That would be a classic example of that would be the 2001 vintage or the 1983 vintage, which would be typically what we would consider weaker vintages in Bordeaux, but were very strong for Margaux region wines. 2003 was a bit of an anomaly, and this is one of the reasons you need to actually taste wines. Because if you just looked at the vintage and just looked at the reports and what people say about the vintage, you might not get an accurate representation of this wine, at least how I've tasted it over the last day or so. 2003 was a very hot vintage at the beginning, and that made that the picking of the grapes for Chateau Margaux was very early. It began in September 10th, which was as early in 1989, and which was the earliest vintage of picking since 1893. So it was very hot. Generally speaking, that's good for certain things. It gives you good ripeness and good concentration of flavors. Having said that, some of the problems with a really hot vintage is that wines can be a bit flabby, and it should be not as fresh in terms of the acidity. But when Chateau Margaux actually did the testing on this wine, it actually came out that the acidity was in line with most of the vintages for the last 20 years. So it should have been low in acidity, but somehow it wasn't. It should have been a little bit flabby, but somehow it wasn't. And that's why it can be dangerous to just take a generalization. We don't know exactly why certain wines perform a certain way in a certain year. And we can only taste with our palates and then just enjoy. The 2003 vintage of Chateau Margaux was a blend of 87% Cabernet Sauvignon, 8% Merlot, 3% Petit Verdot, and 2% Cabernet Franc. The wine was fermented in temperature-controlled stainless steel vats, underwent malolactic fermentation in barrel, and then was aged 18 months in 100% new French oak. So there's a couple of misconceptions about Chateau Margaux. One, that somehow it's because it has some Merlot, it's Merlot dominant. It's not. It's actually Cabernet Sauvignon dominant, but it has a higher proportion of Merlot than perhaps some of the famous wines in Pauillac and St. Julien. Secondly is that somehow the wine is soft. That's not really Chateau Margaux's characteristic in my opinion. It is a very gentle, elegant wine, but soft implies that it's somehow not as tannic as Chateau Lafite or some of the other wines on the left bank, and that's not the case. that would be a misnomer and give you a wrong idea of Chateau Margaux. So if you think Chateau Margaux is a soft, dilute wine, that's not the characteristic of it. It is more elegant than the other wines, and it's really hard to describe what I mean by elegant unless you've actually tasted the wines. But if you compared Chateau Margaux to other wines of the same vintage, you would come up with a description of elegant. And it's very hard to describe how you get that sense, but by tasting you would know what I mean. So again, I think that's where people get this wrong idea that Margaux wines have to be feminine or have to be somehow aromatic. I think what is attractive to people about Chateau Margaux is this elegance and this smoothness, this balance that is very easily acceptable to people. So it's not that it's weak, it's not that it's dilute, but it's very balanced so that you do not feel the harshness of the tannins. And by that, some people say, oh, that's a soft wine. That's not a great descriptor. It's a better descriptor for this wine, I think, is elegance and also a balance. So after all this talking, let's go to the tasting of this wine. I will let you know that I've had this open now for the last 2 days. I have drunk the bottle by myself with different foods, spaghetti, pizza, chicken wings, tried it with different things. And my initial impression of this wine when I opened this was, this is so nice, this wine. There are very few wines that I pop and open that are so out of the bottle magnificent. To the point where the first thing I thought in my mind, I wanted to check the scores of this wine, is like, is this a 100-point wine? It was so good. And I can't recall the last time that I've opened a wine that in the 2000s where I thought, wow, this is really, really good. Generally, it's a little bit tannic when you open it in the bottle, and then through aeration gets better with time. Or the wine is really good and then through aeration it declines. That's not the case. This was consistent over the 2 days of tasting this wine. It still brought the same pleasure to me. And I thought it was a very consistent wine. It's not weak at all, but it's very elegant. That's the only descriptor that I can have. And it is, if you compared it to Chateau Latour, Lafite, Haut-Brion, and Mouton, they don't taste like this. So let's go through it in terms of what I taste and smell. So on the nose right now, when I first opened the bottle, there was a lot more oak aging on this wine. Now I feel that there's much more red fruit. There's a little bit of a floral component to it. But by floral, I mean more like violets, not like roses, like very aromatic flowers. So when sometimes people say that Margaux wines are floral, that doesn't necessarily mean the sweet floral of roses. It could mean other types of floral components. And in this case, it's almost more towards like violets and chrysanthemums, that type of kind of aroma. A more, not bitter, but a more savory floral component rather than a sweet floral component that you see in roses. On the taste, it's not heavy, and people say that the acidity of this wine should be low because it's a very hot year. It's not high, but it's not, I don't know how to describe it. I would say it's medium acidity, but it's still vibrant, which is the funny thing. It's a very peculiar thing. It's not high acidity, but somehow it's still got that vibrancy. And it's hard to explain this technically, but all I can tell you is how I taste it, which is I can tell this is not a high acidity wine, but it tastes fresh to me and it's very balanced. The core fruit is dark fruits like blackberries, black currants, boysenberries, and then you do have some red fruits coming through there, maybe some red cherries, maybe some raspberries in there. You have an assortment of that. Then you get to an aftertaste that is chocolatey, a cocoa powder, and a little bit of earthiness to it. The tannins are very integrated. I wouldn't say they're soft. They are very smooth. They're smooth. The tannin level is medium to medium plus, but the tannins are smooth. And that's the difference. That's the quality of the tannins. The tannins on this wine remind me much of the quality of the tannins from Tokalon in Napa Valley. I know they don't have that herbaceousness component, but the smoothness of the tannins reminds me of that. That's a classic example of a really good quality tannin where a wine can be high in tannin, but the tannins can still be smooth and not rough. There's a sweet component to this at the end, which is almost like glycerol, and it's very pleasant through and through. I've been drinking this wine for 2 days, and it's really hard to find a flaw. Again, when I first started drinking this wine, I really thought to myself, this has got to be a 100-point wine. So I checked the scores. It wasn't, I don't believe. And as I drink through it, I think I calmed down. But it's still a magnificent wine. And the taste profile hasn't changed very much. It's probably, the oak component has softened a bit. You don't see as much, and you see more fruit. I still think it's a very balanced and young wine at this point. So it's showing mostly still primary fruit flavors. That's not to mean it's racy or it's not complex. It's a matter of it's still quite youthful. I would say it's still going towards its plateau, or maybe at the early part of plateau. I think this wine has a long life, say 20, 25 years. And I'm really happy with this. In particular, I find that some of the 2003 vintage wines are still quite tannic. That's not the case with this wine. I think this is very drinkable right now. It still will improve. And so just comparing and contrasting to the review that I did on the 1995 Margaux, I think this is a better representation of classic Chateau Margaux wines. I think I rated that vintage, the 1995 vintage, or 93 points. I'm going to rate this 98 points. It's really good, and I think it will continue to get better. It is everything that you want in a Chateau Margaux wine. And I've always said that if I was comparing the best vintages of Chateau Margaux to every other first growth, I would probably prefer Chateau Margaux in the best example vintages. And this is a really, really good example of Chateau Margaux. Again, I've been drinking this for 2 days, assessing this wine, and really cannot find much flaw in this wine. I've tasted it with everything. I've tasted it in every situation. I've looked at every component of this wine, whether it be smell, taste, aftertaste, mid-palate. There's not a lot of flaws in this wine. And, you know, it's just a really, really spectacular wine, and such an appropriate wine for my million view wine on YouTube. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and until next time, happy drinking.